last session, we told you that communication of acceptance, that if a party accepts an offer, the acceptance must be communicated. Let's take down the rules of communication of acceptance. If acceptance is by a promise, the other party must be notified that you accept. This is called a bilateral contract. So if you're accepting a bilateral contract, which is a promise for a promise, you must let the other party know you accept. If acceptance is by performance of an act, no notification of acceptance is required unless requested. Doing the act indicates acceptance. This is called a unilateral contract. And if you remember, a unilateral contract is a promise for an act. Now we move to the second element of contracts, which is called consideration. As I told you, consideration is what one gives or receives for the promise. The formal legal name of consideration is bargain for legal detriment. The elements, the first one is bargain. Bargain is the process by which the legal detriment consideration is determined. You know that you have to exchange something. How do you determine what you exchange? You bargain. The next element is called legal detriment. And legal detriment is what one gives or receives for the promise. Legal detriment may be a promise to do something. Number two, a promise not to do something, forbearance. And number three, the giving up of a legal right. So one of the things you can use as legal detriment is your promise to do something. Or you can use as legal detriment your promise not to do something. Or the giving up of a legal right. For example, if you're in a lawsuit and you agree to settle in return for something, then you've given up your legal right to sue. Now we move on to the third element, capacity. But before we move on to capacity, let's continue with this. The courts are usually not concerned with what the parties give up. Their only concern is that there be an exchange. To determine whether or not there is an exchange, the court uses what is called the benefit-detriment test. Did each party gain something? Did each party lose something? When we study consideration, we know that some things cannot be used as consideration. Number one, a promise to do something that one is already promised to do. Number two, love and affection cannot be used as consideration. When we study consideration, we're studying the basis for the promise. There are exceptions to the consideration rule. Number one, that's an exception, is promissory estoppel, which we told you that means you are stopped by your promise. Number two, that's an exception, is a new promise to pay debts after a discharge in bankruptcy. If you know anything about bankruptcy, then you know that when you go bankrupt, all your debts are wiped out. So if you go to a party you owe money, that debt was wiped out by bankruptcy, and you make a new promise to pay, then that promise need not be supported by consideration. The next that will be an exception is called charitable contributions. When you make a gift to charity, the charity doesn't have to give you anything in exchange. Now, moving on to capacity. Capacity is the third element of contracts. Capacity, in order to have a valid contract, the parties must have the legal capacity to incur, I-N-C-U-R, voidable, V-O-I-D-A-B-L-E, voidable contractual obligations. Incapacity arises from the following causes. Number one, infancy. And please note that an infant is anyone under 18 years of age. Number two, mental illness or defect. Number three, intoxication and drugs. And number four, judicially declared incompetency. Let's take infancy first. An infant may avoid a contract entered into during infancy. The infant need not take any action until reaching the age of majority. And you should note that that is age 18. A failure to act within a reasonable time of reaching majority gives rise to ratification, meaning that you accept the contract. What is ratification? Ratification is any positive act which indicates acceptance to the agreement. Infants may also avoid contracts for necessaries, food, rent, and shelter, and clothing, but must pay the fair market value of any goods used and not returned. In New York, infants may not avoid contracts for rent. This is so that landlords will rent to infants because there are a large number of married infants, and if landlords knew that they could get out of paying the rent, they wouldn't rent to them. Now, this is the important part. Only the infant, I'll repeat that, only the infant may avoid the contract. So if you enter into a contract with someone and you later discover they're an infant, you can't get out of the contract. Only the infant. Let's take mental illness and defect. Now, one of the things I wanted you to be very clear about, mental illness is not the same as being what we call crazy. Almost all people suffer some form of mental illness, but it doesn't prevent them from functioning. So merely having mental illness will not allow you to avoid the contract. When a person enters a contract while suffering from some mental illness or defect, or who is intoxicated or on drugs, enters a voidable contract if by reason of the condition, number one, they did not understand the nature or consequences of their action. Number two, unable to act in relation to the agreement. Now, number one is if the mental illness prevents you from making an informed and competent decision, then you can avoid the contract. But as I say, people suffer from mental illness and they still can function. So the burden is to prove that the mental illness caused you not to understand the nature or consequences of your action. Number two, unable to act in relation to the agreement means that because of the mental illness, you make promises that you cannot keep. For example, a homeless person telling you they'll sell you their house. That can't be kept. Now notice the same rules apply to drugs and intoxication. As we know, some people can use drugs or drink and still can function. We also know people who can take drugs and take a drink and can't function at all. So the law says that if the drugs cause you not to understand the nature or consequences of your actions, or the alcohol causes you not to understand the nature or consequences of your actions, you will be excused from the contract. Our next one is called judicially declared incompetency. Judicially declared incompetency is when a person who has entered a contract who has been declared incompetent by a court of law. The contract is void. This is when we have the proverbially mental or craziness, so that people who are unable to function enters void contracts. Now, some other examples of capacity that will allow a person to be excused from the contract is called impossibility of performance. An impossibility of performance applies where a party has promised to do something that becomes objectively impossible, meaning that they can't perform because of something that they have no control over. Impossibility will excuse a party from the contract if it arises from the following causes. Illegality, meaning that the contract is illegal and therefore can't be performed. Death or incapacity, but only if the contract calls for personal service. So, for example, if you want Picasso to paint your picture and Picasso dies, then it becomes impossible. But if you hire Picasso's firm to paint your picture and he dies, then the contract still goes on because the firm can complete it. And destruction of the subject matter, but only if the destruction is beyond human control. If it can be replaced, then it's not impossibility of performance. Our next thing is called frustration of purpose. That too can affect capacity. And frustration of purpose occurs when the value of the performance bargained for becomes useless due to an event not anticipated at the time of contract making. In other words, as the result of a supervening event, remember supervening, a supervening event not anticipated when the agreement was made. If it can be corrected, then that is the only remedy that the parties have. Our next one is called legality, which is the fourth element of contracts. And legality is that the object or purpose of the contract must be lawful. As I told you, the law will not enforce an illegal agreement. So therefore, if the purpose of the contract is illegal, it is not enforceable in court. The importance of all of this capacity is that we're required to know who we are dealing with. As I told you, there can be no blind acceptance. And therefore, the law imposes a duty on us to know who we are dealing with. And therefore, frustration of purpose. Therefore, impossibility of performance.